In the winter of 1847, deep in Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains, an entire family simply vanished. Neighbors saw the smoke rising from their property for months, yet no one ever saw Eleanor Harwick or her sons again. For decades, people whispered that the mountain had swallowed them whole, but the truth, uncovered years later, was far darker than anyone could have imagined. What happened inside that smokehouse was not just survival, it was justice served, in the most terrifying way possible. Before we dive into this shocking case, drop a comment below to tell us where you're watching from today, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you want more stories the history books tried to bury.
The smoke from the Harwick family's smokehouse curled into the sky day after day, a constant signal in the wilderness, even though neighbors hadn't seen a single cow or hog on their land in months. This was no ordinary mountain ghost tale. It was a warning born from the clash of desperation and vengeance in the most hidden corners of America. The year was 1847, and deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Western Virginia, secrets lay buried in the hollows, secrets polite society chose to ignore. In a secluded valley, where dawn's mist wrapped itself around ancient oaks, and the nearest settlement lay a day's ride away through treacherous mountain passes, the Harwick homestead rose like a scar against the wilderness. The groan of wagon, wheels over rock, the sharp bite of smoke mixed with something sweeter in the air, and the rough-hewn timbers of the main house all told the story of a family determined to force a life out of land that resisted them at every turn. Marcus Harwick built his fortune on three pillars: illicit whiskey, brutal isolation, and human bondage. Unlike Virginia's tidewater plantations that thrived on fertile fields of tobacco and cotton, Harwick carved his empire high in the mountains, where federal eyes seldom pried. His land sprawled across nearly 2,000 acres of dense, unforgiving forest, accessible only by a winding trail his sons could navigate blindfolded. 4 years earlier, in 1843, Harwick had purchased 6 enslaved individuals from a failing plantation near Richmond. Their names, Samuel, Ruth, Moses, Sarah, Joshua, and Thomas, appeared in courthouse records decades later, reduced to a cold ledger of human property. Shackled and chained, they endured a 2-week wagon journey into the mountains, stopping only at discreet way stations that turned a blind eye to Harwick's trade. Oral histories gathered nearly a century later described their arrival in late autumn, just as the first snows began to dust the high peaks. But the Harwick property was no grand plantation. There were no sweeping cotton fields, only steep corn slopes, small gardens, and a hidden distillery carved into caves behind the house. Marcus, his wife Eleanor, and their 3 grown sons, David, William, and James, built their empire on moonshine, the strongest in the Blue Ridge, trading barrels of firewater for gold and goods with buyers who never asked questions. For the enslaved, life was harsher than even the brutal plantation fields of the East. Winter storms dropped temperatures below zero, yet their quarters were nothing more than a drafty log shed with cracks wide enough to let the snow blow in. They hauled water from frozen streams, tended the dangerous stills that belched heat and smoke from the caves, and kept hidden trails cleared so federal revenue agents could never find the operation. Samuel, once a skilled carpenter, became the group's anchor, while his wife Ruth cooked, sewed, and kept their children, 12-year-old Moses and 8-year-old Sarah, busy with small tasks their hands could manage. Joshua and Thomas, seasoned field workers, adapted to the mountain's harsh demands, and together the 6 formed a fragile but tight-knit community, bound by shared suffering and an unspoken will to endure. Yet the Harwicks ruled with cruelty. Eleanor, far from the refined image of a plantation mistress, kept a leather whip by the kitchen door and wielded it herself when punishments were called for. David, the eldest son, seemed to invent new torments for his own amusement, while William and James followed their family's system of control without hesitation. At the heart of the property stood the smokehouse, built of oak logs and fieldstone, 20 by 30 feet, with a chimney that carried the scent of hickory and oak fires across the valley. It was here the family salted and smoked venison, bear, wild boar, and the occasional livestock obtained in trade. But the smoke carried whispers of something more sinister. Long before the Harwicks, the Cherokee had hunted these valleys, until they were driven west during the Trail of Tears a decade earlier. They left behind stories of dark presences in the mountains, tales settlers repeated only in hushed voices, stories that hinted that not all the smoke rising from Harwick's chimney came from the flesh of animals. The Cherokee once spoke of a cursed hollow deep in the Blue Ridge, a place they called the Hungry Valley, where deer vanished, crops withered, and restless spirits wandered without peace. By the harsh winter of 1846, that valley wrapped itself around the Harwick homestead like a living curse. The enslaved workers endured not only the relentless brutality of bondage, but also the crushing isolation that turned escape into a near impossibility. The nearest town was 40 miles away, across mountain passes rendered impassable by snow and ice. Even if they managed to flee, Virginia's unforgiving fugitive slave laws all but guaranteed capture, return, and a punishment worse than death. Samuel, however, was not a man resigned to despair. Careful, patient, and quietly determined, he studied the rhythms of the Harwick household. He observed who held keys, when the dogs were fed, who tended the fires, and which windows were left unlatched at night. Each detail was stored in his memory like pieces of a puzzle he hoped one day to complete. Yet, in their arrogance, the Harwicks had grown careless. They believed themselves untouchable in their mountain fortress, blind to the cracks forming in their own walls. The smokehouse, standing slightly apart from the main house, loomed large in Samuel's calculations. More than just a storehouse, it was a vulnerable choke point, filled with knives, cleavers, and heavy tools that could become weapons if the moment came. What Samuel didn't realize was that his silent resistance hadn't gone unnoticed. The Harwicks had been watching just as intently. They saw his wandering hands test door latches, heard the hushed tones of midnight conversations, and marked the sharp light in his eyes whenever he studied the property. The stage was being set, though neither side yet knew who would survive. The coming storm. On February 14th, 1847, the mountains fell silent. At exactly 11:43 that night, the dogs ceased their barking, and in that eerie hush, the predators prepared to strike. Ice glazed the smokehouse, windows with delicate patterns as the wind hissed through cracks in the logs. David Harwick tightened a coil of rough hemp rope in his hands, the smell of iron and fear heavy in the air. 3 days earlier, Marcus had uncovered Samuel's secret. A loose board beneath the cabin floor revealed dried meat, a compass stolen from William's room, and most damning of all, a hand-drawn map tracing a path toward freedom in Pennsylvania. The evidence now lay spread across the kitchen table, glowing under the flicker of whale oil lamps, as if it were Samuel's death sentence. Eleanor sharpened a butcher's knife with long, deliberate strokes, her thin lips drawn tight, her voice carrying the final verdict. "Mercy breeds rebellion," she muttered. "Your father's softness has cost us dearly." David, standing at the window, stared toward the dark silhouette of the smokehouse. "We'll hang the carpenter first," he declared coldly. "The others will obey once they see their leader swaying from the rafters." James, eager to prove himself, had already tied the noose with the same knots their grandfather once used, in frontier justice back in Kentucky. The plan was savage in its simplicity: drag Samuel from his bed, make the others watch his execution, and leave his body to decay through the spring thaw as a grisly warning. Yet what the Harwicks failed to understand was that Samuel had not been plotting mere escape. He had been preparing for war. In the whispered Cherokee legends dismissed as superstition, he found practical wisdom: how to survive in bitter winters, how to turn the land itself into an ally, and how to wait for the perfect moment when predator and prey traded places. Samuel had always listened with intent, gathering every scrap of wisdom from old frontiersmen in the nearest settlement. They spoke of how native fighters once used the mountains themselves as allies, turning terrain, weather, and isolation into weapons. The lesson was clear: when stripped of everything, even the powerless could accomplish the impossible. Through the thin log walls of their quarters, Samuel and the others heard the Harwicks plotting their execution, as if the family were sitting in the same room. Winter air carried sound like glass, amplifying every cruel word. By the time Marcus finished outlining their plan, the enslaved group was already acting on their own. Ruth, sharp-eyed and patient, had memorized Eleanor's nightly routine: how the matriarch always inspected the smokehouse fires before bed. Joshua and Thomas had tested the outbuildings, discovering that meat hooks could be lifted from their rafters with ease, their sharp steel promising more than one purpose. Young Moses, despite being only 12, had quietly mapped the family's sleeping quarters, noting where weapons lay within reach. The irony was brutal. Both sides had chosen the smokehouse as the stage for what came next. That night, the temperature plummeted to 18 degrees below zero, as confirmed decades later by almanac records in the Virginia State Library. The cold worked silently in Samuel's favor. Metal grew brittle. The earth froze solid enough to mask tracks, and the family's fierce hounds were brought inside for warmth. At midnight, Samuel slipped from the quarters through a window he had weakened night after night, until the latch gave way with little sound. Timing was everything. Eleanor always visited the smokehouse around 12:30, a habit ingrained over 4 years. 15 minutes before her arrival, Samuel was already inside. He stirred the coals back to life, their glow painting the room in hues of blood red and shadow. He pressed himself behind a thick support beam, hidden among chains and hooks that swayed faintly in the draft. The smokehouse resembled a cathedral of butchery. Tables stained with years of slaughter, rafters heavy with iron tools, the air thick with hickory smoke and salted flesh. Joshua arrived carrying rope braided from hemp scraps. Thomas followed, with tools once meant for butchering hogs, and young Moses took his place as lookout, ready to warn them if anyone but Eleanor approached. Ruth stayed behind with Sarah, brewing a foul-smelling pot of herbs to mimic sickness, ready with an alibi if discovery came. At the appointed hour, Eleanor appeared, her cloak drawn tight against the biting cold, a pine torch flaring in one hand, a poker in the other. Her breath clouded in the air as she reached the smokehouse door. The hinges cried out as they always had, but she paid no mind. Inside, the torchlight flickered across slabs of venison and boar, shadows dancing like restless spirits. She did not see Samuel until his hands closed around her throat. In that single minute, the balance of power shifted forever. 6 enslaved souls transformed from victims into something unrecognizable, an unstoppable force born of desperation and fire. The hooks, cleavers, and blades once used to preserve life for the Harwicks would now decide their fate. The smokehouse, once a place of survival, became an altar of reckoning. Eleanor's torch fell, sputtering out against the dirt floor, and the chamber collapsed into darkness, broken only by the red pulse of dying embers. The Cherokee had been right about the Hungry Valley. Some places consume the living as surely as they hold the dead. In that frozen midnight hour, 4 years of planning crashed headlong into raw desperation, and even the mountains seemed to fall silent, as if it too were watching. The struggle was over in less than 3 minutes, yet in those minutes the fragile balance of power in the Blue Ridge was shattered forever. Samuel's hands clamped around Eleanor Harwick's throat before her scream could leave her lips. Years of carpentry had forged his grip into something more than human, strong enough to splinter oak, unrelenting enough to crush bone. Joshua slammed the door shut while Thomas seized the fallen torch, coaxing it back to life in the coals. In its wavering light, Eleanor's eyes bulged wide, the dawning terror of a woman who realized death had come for her sooner than expected. But Samuel wasn't rushing. His voice was low, steady, almost reverent. 4 years. 4 years you've treated us like beasts, worked us past breaking, fed us scraps while you feasted. Eleanor clawed at his arms, her nails raking blood, but his grip held like iron. He forced her gaze upward, toward the hooks that lined the rafters, the blood-darkened tables, the very tools that had preserved the Harwicks through winter, and would now become instruments of judgment. Historical accounts place Eleanor Harwick at 53 years old, a woman who for decades had overseen cruelty with cold precision. Decades later, letters uncovered in an estate sale revealed her chilling mindset. To her sister in Richmond, she wrote of mountain stock, requiring harsher measures than those on plantations, warning that desperate animals will gnaw off their own limbs to escape. Samuel loosened his grip just long enough for her to gasp a single ragged breath. "You want to know about desperate animals?" he whispered. "Tonight, you'll learn." What followed blurred the lines between revenge, survival, and something older than law. Thomas drew a razor-thin knife, its blade honed for small game. Joshua pinned Eleanor's arms while Samuel kept her silent but conscious, holding her in that twilight between life and death. The mountains had their own justice, primitive, unyielding, and the Cherokee stories whispered of consuming an enemy's strength to break their power. Though Samuel and the others had been raised Christian, years of torment and isolation stripped away those teachings, leaving only the raw law of survival. Eleanor's eyes darted, her lips shaping pleas that dissolved into choked whispers. But mercy had no place in the smokehouse that night. "The others will wake," Joshua murmured, nodding toward the flicker of light in the main house window. "Let them," Samuel said firmly. "We're done running." The fire blazed higher, its shadows twisting across stone walls until the smokehouse resembled something infernal, a place of transformation rather than preservation. The air thickened with wood smoke and the sharp tang of fresh blood, a scent the cold night could not mask. Eleanor Harwick's death came slowly, her final moments drawn out beneath the hands of those she had once controlled. By the time her heartbeat faded, Thomas had already begun working with grim precision, using the same techniques once reserved for venison and boar. This time, however, the process was not meant for sustenance. It was meant to erase the old order and forge something new in fire, blood, and unbreakable resolve. This was no longer about vengeance. It was about transformation. The flesh of an oppressor had become the very means of survival for those she had brutalized. While the Harwick men slept soundly within their thick-walled home, confident in their fortress and blind to the storm that had already broken over them, Samuel and the others worked in silence. Marcus dreamed of the execution he planned for morning, unaware that his wife would never see another dawn. David, William, and James rested like men who had never tasted fear, never stood eye to eye with people who had nothing left to lose. In the smokehouse, Samuel washed Eleanor's blood from his hands in a wooden bucket, the water shifting from pink to red to black beneath the firelight. He caught his reflection in the surface and recognized someone new. No longer a victim, but a man capable of anything necessary to endure. The work carried on through the night. Thomas's hands moved with grim efficiency, his years of butchering, game repurposed for something darker. Joshua tended the fires with practiced care, ensuring the right heat and air circulation. By 3 in the morning, there was no trace of Eleanor Harwick left to recognize. Her clothing had fed the flames, her bones crushed into coals, her flesh trimmed into precise strips that now hung from the rafters. To anyone outside, the smokehouse looked ordinary. To those inside, it had become an altar of survival. Samuel stepped into the frigid air, inhaling deeply. Dawn was still hours away, but the most dangerous part was finished. Eleanor was gone, and in her place hung the food that would carry 6 desperate souls through the most brutal Blue Ridge winter on record. The Cherokee once told stories of warriors who consumed their enemies to claim their strength. Samuel now understood a deeper truth. This was not about power alone. It was about reclaiming dignity, seizing life back from the jaws of cruelty through an act so unthinkable it blurred the line between human and beast. From the chimney rose smoke carrying a scent no passerby could name. Richer than oak, sharper than hickory. It might have been mistaken for some exotic wood or secret seasoning. In reality, it was the scent of justice rendered strip by strip, salted and cured into sustenance. Meanwhile, the Harwick house still slept. 4 more family members lay in their beds, oblivious to the fact that their matriarch would never again sharpen her butcher's knife against stone. But the enslaved were only beginning. Just before dawn, Marcus stirred awake. The silence struck him first. No creak of floorboards, no rattle of pots, no gentle hum of Eleanor preparing breakfast. Absence itself became an omen, a gap in the world he had ruled with certainty. He pulled on boots and coat, assuming she had risen early to check the fires. The February cold was punishing, and keeping the smokehouse heat steady was vital. Yet when he stepped outside, he found the door slightly ajar, smoke curling as always from the chimney. Nothing seemed out of place. The fires glowed, the tools gleamed, and the rows of meat hung with flawless precision. It all looked perfect. But Marcus knew the rhythms of his land too well, and in perfection he felt the first stirring of dread. Marcus Harwick knew the rhythm of his smokehouse as well as he knew the rhythm of his own heartbeat. He knew the size of every cut, the look of venison muscle, the marbled grain of wild boar. But what dangled before him now was wrong. Darker, unfamiliar, arranged in portions too large to have come from their recent hunts. "Eleanor?" he called, his voice bouncing back from the stone walls. The only reply was the hiss of fat dripping onto the coals, the whistle of winter air through the chimney. His eyes fell to the tables where his wife worked with surgical precision. Though scrubbed, fresh stains bled through the grain, darker than they should have been. A bucket of bloodied water sat nearby, its surface glowing orange in the firelight. Eleanor never left standing water, never let her workspace lie unfinished. The true shock, though, came when Marcus spotted her knife, the blade she kept sharper than any razor, always stored in its rightful place. Now it lay abandoned on the table, its edge unnaturally dark. Worse still, several knives were missing. Altogether, tools Eleanor would never have carried from the smokehouse. David entered as his father puzzled over the scene. At 28, the eldest Harwick son had inherited both suspicion and meticulousness. He immediately noticed what his father had overlooked. "This isn't right," he muttered, pointing to a massive hindquarter hanging in plain sight. "We haven't taken a deer this size in months. Where did it come from?" Marcus had no answer. Their hunting records were thorough, carefully, kept not just for practical needs but to deflect the occasional curiosity of federal agents. According to the ledger, their supplies should have been dwindling, not expanding. Within minutes, William and James joined them. Together, the four men stood in the smokehouse, surrounded by evidence that mocked explanation. Eleanor was gone, her absence impossible to excuse by any ordinary means. Marcus ordered a search of the quarters. They found nothing. 6 enslaved, workers who should have been preparing for the day had vanished as completely as Eleanor. Their meager possessions remained, beds untouched, no signs of flight or struggle. Even the frozen ground outside yielded no footprints. The weapons hung, where they always had, untouched, while livestock and horses showed no sign of disturbance. Whatever had happened, it had left no tracks, no noise, no logic. By noon, Marcus faced the unthinkable. 7 people had vanished under conditions that defied reason, leaving behind nothing but unfamiliar cuts of meat and the creeping sense that the mountain itself was keeping secrets. William suggested bringing in men from the settlement. "We'll need help to cover ground." But Marcus shook his head, his jaw set. "And tell them what? That my wife and 6 slaves disappeared into thin air? That we've got meat hanging we can't explain? They'll think us mad. Or worse." He knew the truth. Their entire world depended on silence. The still hidden distillery, the brutality of their labor system, their isolationist ways, all of it would collapse under the scrutiny of outsiders. David, cold-eyed and calculating, spoke the words that doomed them. "We wait. We act as if nothing has changed. If they're coming back, they'll return." It was a choice between truth and survival, and they chose silence. But silence has a price, and in the hungry valley of the Blue Ridge, the debt was about to come due. That evening, the Harwick men sat at their long wooden table, bowls of steaming stew set before them. James was the first to break the uneasy silence. "The meat tastes different," he said slowly, chewing with a puzzled expression. "Richer. Almost better." His words hung in the air like smoke. Marcus had noticed the same unsettling truth, but had refused to give it voice. The stew, prepared exactly as Eleanor would have made it, was more flavorful than anything they had eaten before, so savory it bordered on decadent, and that, more than anything, made it terrifying. Outside, the smokehouse chimney puffed steadily into the night sky, feeding the slow fires that preserved their winter supply. Yet none of the men could shake the feeling that they were preserving something far more disturbing than venison or boar. By morning, the unease deepened into dread. Breakfast appeared on the kitchen table, flawless in every detail. Cornbread baked in Eleanor's favorite pan, butter churned smooth, smoked meat arranged neatly on her finest china, and coffee brewed to Marcus's exact preference, sweetened, with honey in just the way Eleanor had learned over 2 decades of marriage. The food was perfect, too perfect. Yet the house remained locked from the inside, the windows unbroken, the doors untouched. Whoever had prepared the meal not only knew the family's intimate routines, but possessed knowledge only Eleanor should have carried to her grave. "This is impossible," David muttered, staring at the strips of meat on his plate. James picked one up, studying its marbled fat and tenderness. It wasn't venison, and it wasn't boar. "Where would she have gotten meat like this?" he asked, his voice trembling. "We haven't traded in weeks." No one answered, because the question itself carried a truth they were not ready to face. Determined to find clarity, William volunteered to search the smokehouse once more. At first glance, everything was as before. The fires steady, the meat hanging in neat rows, the tools gleaming. But now he saw the subtle details he had missed. Knife marks etched into the cutting tables that bore no resemblance to Eleanor's precise butchering style. Cuts angled differently, deeper, as if intended for something other than food preservation. An inventory revealed new strips of meat, still damp, prepared overnight in quantities Eleanor could never have managed alone. Then came the most chilling discovery. Buried beneath salt-curing supplies were tools that did not belong in the smokehouse. Eleanor's sewing scissors, a fine carving knife from the dining room, and worst of all, Marcus's straight razor. These weren't butcher's tools. They were surgical, chosen with deliberate care for work that went beyond slaughter. William's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make sense of the scene. That was when he heard the voice, low and steady, from directly behind him. Looking for something? He spun around, and there they were, the 6 who had vanished. Samuel, Ruth, Moses, Sarah, Joshua, and Thomas stood in the doorway of the smokehouse, not gaunt or desperate, but strong, calm, and well-fed. Samuel stepped forward, a meat cleaver glinting in his hand, the firelight dancing along its edge. The Harwicks had spent their lives believing they owned these people, but now, standing in their own smokehouse, the balance of power had shifted, and for the first time, Marcus's sons understood what it meant to be prey. Ruth stood beside Samuel, a filleting knife gleaming in her grip, while Joshua and Thomas sealed the doorway with tools held like extensions of their fury. Even young Moses carried a weapon, one of Eleanor's quilting needles honed into a deadly point. William, desperate to summon the authority that had always shielded him, demanded, "Where is my mother?" Samuel's voice was steady, his words a hammer striking truth. "Your mother is exactly where she belongs," he said, nodding toward the hanging strips of meat that smoked gently in the rafters. Sustenance for those she had starved for 4 long years. The meaning struck William with physical force. The strange flavors, the abundance of meat, the meals prepared with impossible knowledge of Eleanor's recipes, it all collapsed into a horrifying truth. "That's impossible," he muttered. We don't." Ruth cut him off, her tone as calm as winter ice. "People don't eat people. Your family has been consuming human flesh for months. The only difference now is that you finally know where it came from." History held grim parallels. The Donner Party, the desperate colonists at Jamestown. But this was something different. This wasn't starvation. This was deliberate, ritual, justice clothed in blood and smoke. Samuel stepped forward, lifting Eleanor's butcher knife as if it had always been his. "Your mother was a teacher until the very end," he said with chilling casualness. "She showed us how to divide a carcass, which cuts last longest, how to season properly so nothing goes to waste." He tested the edge on his thumb, a bead of blood rising, but his face showed no pain. She was very thorough. William staggered back, only to find Joshua and Thomas blocking every escape. The smokehouse, once their family's sanctuary of survival, had become a cage. "What do you want?" William whispered. Samuel's answer came without hesitation. "What we've always wanted, freedom. But since your family denied us that, we've settled for something else." He gestured toward the hooks and chains. Once they held venison and boar, now they bore shackles and straps refashioned for human prey. "We want justice," Samuel said, his voice low and final. "And we want to survive the winter. Your family has provided both." William's terror sharpened into clarity. He was not leaving the smokehouse alive. Worse, his death would mirror the fate he had helped enforce, slow, methodical, and merciless. His screams rang out across the valley, lasting 17 minutes, before the mountains swallowed them. In that time, 3 generations of cruelty collapsed into the oldest form of judgment known to man. When civilization fails, the wilderness supplies its own verdict. From that night onward, the Harwick legend was no longer a tale of dominance, but of reversal. Samuel laid down principles to govern what remained of the Harwick clan, not arbitrary punishments, but rules rooted in reciprocity. William, Ruth explained, would endure exactly what he had inflicted. No more, no less. Her tone was as steady as a farmer discussing weather. By the end, she said, your mother understood. Every cut she made, every lash she delivered, every meal she withheld, each one returned to her, with interest. The tools laid out on the cutting table gleamed with the familiarity of years spent processing game, but in Samuel's hands they became instruments of grim instruction. He lifted a thin-bladed knife meant for delicate work around joints. This will hurt, he told William with chilling calm. But it won't kill you quickly. Your mother taught us how to keep meat fresh. What followed cannot be recounted in detail without stepping beyond the bounds of decency. Yet it is enough to say that William discovered why the Cherokee had called this hollow the Hungry Valley, and why his mother had written of desperate animals gnawing themselves free in her final months. Inside the main house, Marcus, David, and James heard William's agony carried across the night air, but they were powerless. Their doors had been barred from the outside, secured with the same fortress tricks they themselves had perfected to keep federal agents at bay. The windows were too narrow to crawl through, the thick log walls too strong to breach. Worse still, every weapon, rifle, pistol, axe, even knives for the hearth, had been removed. For years the Harwicks had wielded control through force of arms. Now their captives had stripped them bare. Samuel's voice rang from outside, steady and deliberate. This is helplessness. This is what your property felt every single day. For 4 years, the words cut deeper than any blade. The irony was brutal. The fortress they had built to keep others out had become their cage, perfectly designed to hold them until their captors were ready. Meanwhile, the smokehouse roared with life. Thomas tended the fires with precision. Joshua salted cuts with Eleanor's own attention to detail, and Moses watched the color and texture with the keen eye of a boy growing into his role. The process was no act of chaos, but a carefully designed system, months in the making. The enslaved had not only learned the family's routines but also mastered the technical craft of preservation, the very skill Eleanor had once guarded. Killing had been only the first step. Survival until spring required turning knowledge into sustenance. 3 days later, a traveling preacher named Ezekiel Thornton passed through the valley. His journal, preserved in Winchester County archives, recorded smoke rising peacefully from the Harwick smokehouse. He noted the property seemed prosperous, with Negroes working industriously around the outbuildings, a model of mountain self-sufficiency. Thornton nearly stopped to purchase their famed preserved meats, but decided the weather was too harsh for visiting. Decades later, when his journal was uncovered in a Staunton church renovation, the chilling truth emerged. What he saw was not slavery but freedom. 6 people running a thriving operation with skills learned under duress. The Harwick men were gone, though not absent. They were present in every curl of smoke, in every salted strip of meat hanging neatly from the rafters, their power consumed and transformed into the very substance of survival. Samuel organized the new order with precision, establishing a rotation that kept the smokehouse running around the clock while others tended the distillery that had once been Marcus Harwick's pride. Under their hands, the business flourished in ways the Harwicks had never managed, because for the first time the laborers were the masters of the craft. The moonshine was stronger, cleaner, and far more profitable, crafted by those who understood every step of fermentation and distillation instead of merely following commands. Yet the most complex piece of their survival was psychological. Marcus, David, and James were kept alive, not out of pity, but utility. Each man carried knowledge, trade routes, buyers, financial contacts, that would be extracted as carefully as their flesh until nothing remained but what Samuel's group had absorbed. Ruth's discovery of Eleanor's recipe book added another layer of irony. Tucked within its pages was a section titled Long Pork Preparation for Extended Storage, a chilling sign that Eleanor had once contemplated this very outcome. The winter that followed pressed every skill, every boundary, every shred of morality. But the smoke never ceased rising from the chimney. The hungry valley had been fed, and in feeding it, the balance of power had inverted. By the spring thaw of 1848, the Harwick property was unrecognizable. The snow melted late that year, not until May, but when the streams swelled and wildflowers bloomed, the truth emerged. A federal revenue agent, Joseph McKinley, arrived on May 15th to investigate rumors of illegal distilling. His report, still preserved in the Virginia State Archives, described a property that appeared prosperous and thriving. The smokehouse was stocked, the distillery running smoothly, the buildings well maintained. He noted abundant supplies of preserved meat and assumed a combination of successful hunting and strong trade. He had no idea he was witnessing one of the most dramatic business transformations in the Blue Ridge. Samuel and his companions had not simply survived, they had prospered. Their moonshine, refined with new grain ratios and extended fermentation, commanded higher prices among buyers who prized its purity. Samuel himself negotiated deals, his quiet literacy and sharp mind turning knowledge into leverage, establishing trust with traders who had once bowed only to Marcus Harwick. Meanwhile, the smokehouse evolved from a tool of survival into a commercial enterprise. The winter's experiments had perfected salt blends, curing times, and smoke temperatures, producing meat of exceptional quality. The inventory now mixed venison, boar, and traded game with the preserved remnants of their former oppressors. What had begun as vengeance had become something more enduring, a system of survival and commerce built on the ashes of the Harwick dynasty, and a legend that blurred the lines between justice and horror in the Hungry Valley. Ruth emerged as the quiet architect of the group's survival, crafting recipes that stretched every resource while concealing the true origin of their most controversial ingredients. Drawing from Eleanor's notes and blending them with traditional African flavors remembered from generations past, she created seasonings that were both nourishing and distinct. So distinct, in fact, that customers later praised them as the finest they had ever tasted. Moses and Sarah, still children by age, adapted with a resilience only the young can muster. They learned not only how to tend fires and cure meat, but also how to run ledgers, manage trade, and, most importantly, keep secrets adults would never want to hear. When Agent McKinley visited that spring, searching for evidence of moonshine and the missing Harwicks, Samuel met him with calm composure. He explained that the family had relocated to Richmond for the winter, leaving him in charge of operations. The story was simple, plausible, and convincing enough that McKinley filed no further reports. But the visit forced a reckoning. They could not hide forever behind fiction. Their solution was methodical, like every other step of their revolt. Samuel began presenting himself as a free man hired to manage the Harwick estate, while the others claimed status as wage earners with specialized skills. It was a delicate lie balanced on the legal contradictions of antebellum Virginia, where courts feared revolts, but often looked away when enslaved people blurred the lines of ownership and survival. By summer of 1848, the property operated openly under Samuel's management. Buyers noted the higher quality moonshine and the unmatched consistency of preserved meats, but never asked too many questions about the missing Harwicks. The smokehouse, once a chamber of horror, shifted toward legitimate use as hunting and trading, filled the larder. By late spring, the last remnants of the Harwick family had been consumed, their bodies sustaining 6 souls through the harshest winter in memory. Ruth, ever meticulous, recorded the process in notebooks that would resurface decades later, calculating yields, nutritional values, and even taste comparisons with a precision more suited to a scientific study than desperate survival. Those records revealed not only how they lived, but how the experience reshaped their very understanding of food, justice, and humanity. Local communities, pragmatic and wary of interference, began calling the property the Freedman's Place. Mountain folk respected competence, and Samuel's group had proven themselves capable stewards. Yet whispers lingered. Neighbors remembered the timing of Eleanor's disappearance, the continuous smoke that rose all winter long, and the strangely rich quality of the meats traded during the coldest months. Over time, those fragments hardened into stories. For some, it was a warning against cruelty. Mistreat people long enough, and the mountain itself may rise in judgment. For others, it was a dark reminder that there are boundaries civilization should never cross, no matter the provocation. But for Samuel, Ruth, Joshua, Thomas, and the children, it was nothing more or less than the cost of freedom. The hungry valley had been fed, and in its feeding, it had forged a new order, one the world would never fully understand. The last living thread to the Harwick mystery unraveled in 1923, when 94-year-old Martha Delacqua, frail and fading, in Staunton, Virginia, summoned her grandson to her bedside. Her family later donated his notes to the Virginia Historical Society, ensuring her words would outlive her. For nearly 8 decades, the valley had whispered its version of events, but Martha's confession cut through the fog of legend. "They weren't cannibals," she whispered, her voice trembling against the rattle of mountain wind. "They were free people, doing what free people do, surviving by any means necessary." Her grandson, Thomas Diacroix, expected some small family indiscretion, not a revelation that challenged the very foundations of their community's history. Martha recalled visiting the Harwick property in the spring of 1848, when she was still a girl accompanying her father on a trading run. The operation had continued seamlessly despite the family's disappearance. Moonshine flowed, smoked meat was plentiful, and business remained brisk. "Samuel was the sharpest man I ever met," she told Thomas. "He could tally numbers in his head faster than my father could put them on paper. Ruth's cooking, better than anything we'd ever tasted. And those children, polite, educated. They looked like any other prosperous mountain family." Yet beneath the surface, Martha noticed what others ignored. Meat of exceptional quality, despite no hunting. Subtle changes in smokehouse design, and the absence of even the faintest trace of Marcus, Eleanor, or their sons. "I knew something had happened," she admitted. "But in the mountains, survival means minding your own business." Her most startling memory came from late 1848, when she overheard Samuel negotiating with her father. He had plans to sell the property, uproot his family, and head north to Ohio, where the law might not hunt them so fiercely. The discussions were detailed, terms nearly finalized. But then, nothing. One autumn night, Samuel and his family vanished, leaving behind only an immaculate homestead. Distant Harwick relatives eventually reclaimed it, finding the house scrubbed bare and the smokehouse sealed tight, as though the mountain itself had closed the chapter. When Thomas, stunned, asked his grandmother where Samuel's family had gone, she revealed a small wooden box hidden beneath her mattress. Inside were fragments of a forgotten life, a wooden button carved by Samuel's hand, a faded ribbon once tied in Sarah's hair, and most importantly, a letter in Samuel's own handwriting, dated October 15th, 1848. Its words carried across time like embers still glowing in the dark. "We leave this property to those who can make better use of it than we could. The mountain gave us what we needed to survive, but survival is not the same as living. Freedom requires more than just the absence of chains. It requires more than chains being broken. It requires the power to draw your own moral lines." Samuel's letter ended with a truth carved into every choice they had made. Some choices, once taken, cannot be undone. The valley will always hunger, but we will never again be the ones feeding it. Martha's last words revealed that Samuel's family had not simply disappeared into legend. They had slipped into the currents of the Underground Railroad flowing through Western Virginia, aided quietly by neighbors who chose silence over betrayal. For years, Martha's family received word as they moved north, finally reaching freedom, in Canada before settling near Detroit. There, Samuel became a teacher, Ruth opened a restaurant that earned renown across Michigan, and Moses and Sarah grew into educated adults who built lives untouched by the horrors of their childhood. They were free, not only from bondage, but from the shadow of the hungry valley. Yet the land they left behind never lost its appetite. Neighbors spoke of smoke curling from a sealed chimney, of voices echoing on winter nights, of the unmistakable scent of meat wafting through the valley long after the smokehouse stood empty. For white families, the tales became warnings against cruelty. For black communities, they became proof that resistance, however costly, was possible. The legal ripples of the Harwick disappearance unsettled Virginia's slave codes, forcing lawmakers to confront a truth they had long denied, that enslaved people could organize, manage property, and outwit their oppressors. Decades later, Thomas Decroix entrusted his grandmother's box of relics, Samuel's button, Sarah's ribbon, and that letter of defiance, to the Virginia Historical Society. For years, it gathered dust until researchers in the 1980s and archaeologists in the decades that followed unearthed evidence that confirmed Martha's story. Beneath the smokehouse, they found a hidden chamber arranged like a memorial. Artifacts, from both the Harwicks and Samuels group, each marked with dates tied to that fateful winter. Forensic analysis of bone fragments proved that at least 4 adults had been processed there, their remains preserved with a skill that fused practical necessity with ritual precision. The Hungry Valley had collected its debt in full, a debt multiplied by generations of cruelty and paid back with interest. And yet, locals whisper that on certain winter nights, when the wind snakes through the hollows and wood smoke hangs heavy in the air, another smell lingers, thick, metallic, unmistakable, a reminder that hunger, like justice, is never fully satisfied. And if this story unsettles you, hold on, because the next case cuts even deeper. Subscribe before it drops. The Harwick name disappeared, but the Hungry Valley never stopped feeding. Archaeologists would later uncover chilling evidence beneath the smokehouse floor, confirming that the mountain itself had kept its secrets for generations. Yet even now, locals swear that on cold winter nights, the scent of smoke and meat drifts through the hollows, a reminder that justice, like hunger, is never truly satisfied. If this story left you shaken, share your thoughts in the comments, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next case, one even darker than this.